My name is Sophia, and I let my sister stay in my house for 2 weeks after her breakup. On the 10th day, I flew out for a work conference. When I came back, my key no longer fit the front door. A stranger's car was sitting in my driveway, and an online listing was describing my own home as available immediately. My sister opened the door and told me I was trespassing. I was 28 when this happened, and for a long time I believed the worst part of it was that my sister was simply refusing to move out. I was wrong. The worst part was discovering how many people around me had quietly agreed that my pain was an acceptable price to pay for keeping their own lives comfortable. Before I tell you how the truth finally came out, subscribe to Unheard drama stories. Here, the people who were ignored get to finish their own sentences, and the truth is allowed to arrive without shouting. The favor. My younger sister, Tessa, had always moved through life as though consequences were rude interruptions meant for other people. When her relationships ended, someone always appeared to hand her a couch to sleep on. When she lost a job, our parents quietly paid her car insurance until the next one came along. I was the organized one: schedules, emergency savings, spare batteries in every drawer, and a mortgage I'd taken on completely alone at 26, with no help from anyone. After Tessa's fiancé ended their engagement, she called me sobbing from a parking lot somewhere. She said she just needed somewhere safe for 14 days until her new apartment became available. I agreed, but I wrote the exact dates down in a text message because I remembered how her previous, short stays at our parents' house had somehow stretched into months, every single time. She showed up with 6 suitcases, 2 lamps, and a cat she had never once mentioned to me. I reminded her, gently, that my homeowner's policy and my allergies made that particular arrangement genuinely difficult. She promised the cat would stay in the guest room, and then told me, with a slight edge in her voice, that I was treating her like a tenant. I should have listened much more carefully to the word she chose right there. For a while, I honestly believed the safest response to almost anything was just to keep everyone around me calm. I've had to accept something harder since then, that the people who benefited from that old arrangement will probably never call my new boundary fair. Their agreement was never actually a requirement for my own protection. Looking back, I think about the younger version of me who genuinely believed being loved meant being easy to manage, someone who would have apologized simply for making the room feel uncomfortable. The truth, once I finally let myself see it, was painful, but at least it wasn't shapeless anymore. Small changes. During that first week, Tessa rearranged furniture without asking, forwarded her mail to my address, and asked me for a copy of a utility bill. She said her new apartment complex needed proof of local residence to finalize the lease. I refused to hand over an actual bill, but offered to write her a simple letter confirming she was staying with me temporarily as a guest. She was offended by that, genuinely offended. Our mother called me that same evening and asked me to stop making Tessa feel unwanted. My father, when I mentioned it to him separately, said the house would probably be shared someday anyway, because in his mind, family property was supposed to stay in the family. That comment confused me more than anything else that week. The house wasn't inherited from anyone. I had bought it myself, with my own salary and my own down payment, years before any of this started. Before I left for a 3-day work conference in Chicago, I reminded Tessa one more time that her move-out date was that coming Monday. She hugged me at the door, thanked me for everything, and told me the keys to her new apartment were already ready and waiting for her. At the airport, waiting to board, I got a notification that my smart lock account had been disconnected. I assumed it was a Wi-Fi issue on my end. Tessa texted me almost immediately that everything at the house was completely fine. I understand now something I resisted accepting for far too long. Peace is not the absence of conflict. Sometimes real peace only begins the moment you finally let the necessary conflict happen out in the open, instead of quietly absorbing it to keep everyone comfortable. Stay with me, because what was waiting for me at that front door on Sunday was only the first layer of what my sister had actually built behind my back. The door. I got home Sunday evening and found a brand new deadbolt installed on my own front door. A sedan I didn't recognize was parked in my driveway like it belonged there. My curtains had been replaced with different ones, and a small lockbox was hanging from the porch railing, the kind realtors use for open houses. I knocked. Tessa opened the door only a few inches and told me flatly that I needed to leave. Behind her, I could see a couple standing in my living room, holding printed papers in their hands. Tessa told them, loudly enough for me to hear clearly, that I was an unstable relative trying to interfere with a legitimate rental. I held up my ID and pulled up my mortgage app right there on my phone. The couple went pale almost instantly. They had already paid Tessa a full security deposit plus first month's rent for what she'd called a separate guest suite, a unit that did not exist, had never existed, and was in fact just my own guest room. The online listing included photographs she'd taken secretly while I was away at work. It described the entire first floor of my house as available, and added, almost as an afterthought, that the owner lives out of state. Tessa told me our father had promised her half the house, and that she was simply establishing her rights to it. She threatened to call the police herself if I tried to come inside. I called them first. For a long time, I kept trying to explain everything that was happening in the kindest possible way I could manage, an old habit of mine, softening even the ugliest truths until everyone else in the room felt comfortable again, even in the exact moments when I was clearly the one being hurt. Looking back at it now, I don't think that instinct was ever really kindness. It was fear, dressed up carefully to look like patience. The civil problem. The officers who responded confirmed my identity and my deed on the spot, but they explained that removing Tessa immediately could technically become a civil matter, since she had mail already arriving at the address and was actively claiming residency there. They did, at least, require the prospective tenants to leave, and they documented the rental payment dispute in their report. I didn't force my way through the door. Instead, I called an attorney and stayed with a friend that night. That decision felt humiliating in the moment, if I'm honest, standing outside my own home while my sister stood inside it. But it kept Tessa from being able to accuse me of violence or an unlawful eviction later. My security cameras had all been unplugged, but the cloud history hadn't been touched. It showed Tessa hiring a locksmith and telling him, on camera, that she had simply lost her ownership documents. It also showed my father carrying boxes into my garage 2 full days before I'd even come home. When I called him, he told me he was just helping both daughters reach a fair arrangement. He said he believed I had more stability than Tessa and could tolerate sharing what I'd built. He'd apparently given her an old family letter, one that vaguely mentioned helping each child buy a home someday. She had shown it to the prospective tenants as proof that our parents had funded my house. They hadn't, not $1 of it. What made all of this so hard for people to understand afterward was that none of it looked dramatic from the outside. There were no broken dishes, no shouting matches in the street, no scene dramatic enough to make a stranger stop and stare. All of the actual damage happened quietly, in polite sentences, in delayed replies, in information conveniently left out, in decisions that had already been made long before anyone thought to invite me into the room. The listing money. The rental couple filed a formal police report once Tessa refused to refund their deposit. 2 more people contacted me directly after the listing finally got taken down. One had already paid an application fee. Another had sent a holding deposit specifically for the garage space, which apparently was also somehow available. By the time I added it all up, Tessa had collected more than $7,000 from complete strangers, using photographs of my own home that she'd taken without my knowledge. My attorney served her with a formal notice terminating her guest permission and filed for expedited possession of the property. We also sent the locksmith proof that he had changed the locks for someone with absolutely no ownership authority over the house. He handed over his original work order without hesitation, and it contained a forged version of my signature. My mother begged me to drop the entire case. She said Tessa had used the money to pay off old debts, and that she'd be devastated if criminal charges were filed against her. I asked her, as calmly as I could, whether the strangers Tessa had deceived were allowed to be devastated too. For the first time in this whole ordeal, my mother finally admitted that she and my father had known about the rental idea from the very beginning. They said they'd believed it was only ever for the guest room, and that they'd thought a little extra income might help Tessa finally become independent. Everyone in my family, it turned out, had quietly approved a smaller version of stealing from me. I wish I could say I'd recognized this whole pattern the moment it started. I didn't. When you've loved people for years, your own mind does strange, generous work on their behalf without you even asking it to. It searches for the innocent explanation first. It edits out the sharpest edges. It calls betrayal a misunderstanding, because a misunderstanding still feels like something that can eventually be repaired. If you've ever discovered that the people closest to you had quietly agreed on a version of events that erased you completely, keep listening. Because the hearing that followed changed how my entire family saw what actually happened in that house. The hearing. At the possession hearing, Tessa argued that she had contributed meaningfully to the household and therefore held some kind of ownership interest in it. Her actual contributions, once itemized, turned out to be groceries, a decorative mirror, and exactly one utility payment, made from my own bank account after she'd accessed a saved password without permission. The judge focused entirely on the documents in front of him: my deed, my mortgage, bank records, the original text messages laying out her 14-day stay, camera footage, the rental advertisements themselves, the forged locksmith form. Together, they built an undeniable timeline. The court ordered her to leave within 72 hours and prohibited her from collecting any further payments connected to the property. Tessa cried in the courthouse hallway afterward and told our parents I had made her homeless. My father asked me quietly if I could let her stay just one final month. I said no. That answer felt cruel for maybe 10 full seconds. Then I remembered standing outside my own front door while my sister called me a trespasser through a 2-inch gap. Compassion never required me to recreate the exact condition that had made all of this possible in the first place. That night, I barely slept at all. I kept replaying every small moment from the past few years that I'd quietly dismissed at the time: the changed subject, the nervous glance between my parents, the joke that had landed a little too close to some truth nobody wanted spoken out loud. Separately, each one had seemed like nothing. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer look away from. What was behind the walls? After Tessa finally left, I discovered she had installed a keyed lock on the inside of the guest room door, damaged part of the flooring while moving furniture around, and built an entire partition wall in my garage without a single permit. She had also been opening mail addressed to me and photographing my financial statements. The cat had scratched up the guest room door pretty badly, but honestly, that damage bothered me the least. What actually stayed with me was the feeling that my own home had been quietly studied, room by room, as an opportunity. I changed every lock, every password, every code, and every security question tied to my name. I notified the credit bureaus, redirected my mail, and installed cameras Tessa would never be able to disconnect from inside the house again. The rental victims received partial reimbursement from money recovered out of her account. I personally covered the remaining amount and pursued the rest through formal restitution. Some relatives told me that paying those strangers back myself made me look responsible for what Tessa had done. I did it anyway, because those people had trusted a listing connected directly to my address, and because repairing real harm mattered infinitely more to me than winning some family argument about whose fault it technically was. There's a very particular kind of loneliness in realizing that the people who know you're softest, most private places, have been quietly using that knowledge as a map the entire time. My first reaction wasn't even anger. It was embarrassment, hot and humiliating. It took me a while to remember that trust is not the same thing as stupidity. The shame belonged entirely to the person who exploited it, never to the person who offered it honestly in the first place. The house becomes mine again. For months afterward, I slept badly. Every small sound near the porch sent me straight to the security camera app. I seriously considered selling the house because it genuinely no longer felt private to me anymore. My therapist asked me one afternoon whether leaving would actually feel like freedom or more like surrender. I honestly didn't know the answer. I stayed. I tore out the illegal wall in the garage myself, repainted the guest room from top to bottom, and turned it into a small studio instead of leaving it as a place available for the next family emergency to claim. The first thing I ever made in that room was a slightly crooked wooden sign that reads, "Hospitality is not ownership." I loved it exactly because it wasn't perfectly straight. Tessa entered a diversion program for the forged document and the rental fraud charges. She's been slowly repaying the remaining victims ever since. Our parents ended up paying for her actual apartment, but they were never given a key to my house again, not after everything. The rest of the family called that particular boundary excessive. Excessive is usually just the word people reach for when normal access finally ends after genuinely abnormal behavior. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking what would keep the family calm and started asking, instead, what would actually keep me safe. That one shift in the question changed absolutely everything else that followed. It moved me from constantly reacting to actually planning. From pleading with people to documenting everything carefully. From quietly hoping someone would eventually rescue me to finally understanding that I was allowed to protect myself the entire time. What happened after? Tessa and I haven't spoken directly in over a year now. She sends birthday messages through our mother occasionally. I don't block them, but I also don't mistake contact for actual change. Real change, to me, would look like full restitution, an apology with no attached excuses, and genuine respect for the distance I've asked for. My father eventually admitted, in a rare honest moment, that he had resented the fact that I'd achieved real stability without ever needing his help to get there. Helping Tessa quietly claim part of my house had made him feel necessary again, in a way he clearly missed. Understanding his motive, though, didn't restore his authority over my property. Not even a little. The lockbox from that fake rental listing is still sitting in my garage. I keep it there on purpose, as a reminder that the door to my own life doesn't get opened by guilt, by family pressure, or by someone else's manufactured emergency. I didn't become cold through any of this. I just became unavailable for manipulation. The lesson I kept: a favor does not erase ownership, and a relative's crisis does not create a permanent claim on your home, no matter how it gets framed at the dinner table afterward. Clear texts, careful records, and early legal advice protected me at exactly the moment when emotion was being used against me as evidence. I learned, slowly and the hard way, that being generous without any limits at all isn't actually generosity. It's an open invitation for someone else to quietly decide where you end and they begin. Some people will call your boundary cruel, simply because your silence used to be so convenient for them. Let them say it. A peaceful life built honestly on the truth might look smaller from the outside than the life you gave up to get there. But it feels infinitely larger once you're finally standing inside it free, with nothing left for anyone else to take. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been made to feel selfish simply for protecting yourself, I want you to remember this clearly. Love does not require you to disappear. Subscribe to Unheard Drama Stories for more stories where hidden truths finally get to have a voice.